I directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. Where's the gold?
This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. Thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to hear more about mining, metals, economic freedom, please do consider subscribing on whatever platform you're listening on. We have an old friend of the show, Roman Skaskiw. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but he is an entrepreneur and gentleman who has lived in Ukraine until just recently for a decade. He's also a U.S. veteran. And I just thought there's been so much confusion about Ukraine. We had one episode on it, but just relating to investment. I wanted him to cut through that confusion. So, Roman, welcome back to the show. And please tell us, why is there a war going on? Many of us are confused in this era. Why do people who are, let's say, of similar heritage go to war against each other?
Thank you for having me. The idea that Ukraine needed to stay neutral and joining NATO was the cause for the war, like it was a factor, but it's by no means the reason. Russia has never not been threatening Ukraine, even when NATO membership was nowhere on the radar. The two countries are sort of competing for the same spiritual foundation. They both see themselves as the successors of Kievan Rus, which was a contemporary of Byzantium. And the fact that Ukraine drifts away, it's really upsetting to sort of the Russian sense of themselves. This is revealing in a book that was recently published about the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it's revealed that Yeltsin completely had the same mentality as Putin, where he didn't think Ukraine existed. He didn't think it should exist. And he just thought that Ukraine voting for independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union, he just thought it wouldn't happen. As it turned out, I think over 95% of Ukrainians voted for an independent state. So in the Russian psyche, in the myth that they've created for themselves, there is no Ukraine. Uh, on the flip side, in Ukrainian poetry, folk songs, fighting for freedom against Moscow, it's like that is the foundation. The old freedoms that the Cossacks enjoyed when Ukraine was a frontier and created sort of a nascent frontier state, like that is the foundation of the Ukrainian identity. So it's a very deep problem that goes to the core of how these people see themselves.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily rebuilding the USSR. It is rebuilding just Russia.
Yes, I think it's much more rooted in Imperial Russia than in the USSR, though I think Western observers underestimate how much the USSR was built on the Imperial Russian dream.
And why did it take so long then? Why did it take 30-odd years for the Russians to come in? Although, yeah, of course, they went into Crimea. Why did it take so long for the Russians to come in and say, we're going to annex you?
Well, they believe their own propaganda. I think that's a problem that autocratic states typically have. That's one of the reasons why they've been humiliated militarily, because they believe the propaganda about their own strength and about Ukraine's weakness. But they also believed that Ukraine was drifting into the Russian sphere. One of the first high-level FSB agents that was arrested was the guy who was in charge of subversion in Ukraine. So just like I'm sure when Putin was a KGB or an FSB agent, he was lying to his superiors. I'm sure this guy responsible for Ukraine was also lying to his superiors and saying, "Oh yes, I can snap my fingers and have mass pro-Russian protests in all Ukrainian cities." Um, I think Westerners don't appreciate the extent to which Russia is a civilization of Potemkin villages. That term Potemkin villages refers to when Catherine traveled through Ukraine. Their general Potemkin, who was, I think, in charge of the military escort of her, he built fake villages along her route so that he could claim that he brought her this big, prosperous country. So he actually built physical fake villages so that she could go down the route. And Russia is a civilization of Potemkin villages. Like everything is about keeping up appearances rather than creating the reality. Case in point is how St. Petersburg was built. Tsar Peter traveled through Europe, and he says, "Wow, this is a great civilized modern place. I want to be great and civilized." So the first thing he does, he enslaves 40,000 Russians. He tells them to bring your own food, bring your own tools, marches them in shackles with military escort to St. Petersburg, and they built the city on a swamp. Thousands upon thousands died, and they have the appearance of having a Western style, civilized urban center. And I feel like that's everything that Russia does. Everything is a monstrous caricature of reality.
Yeah, I don't want to get. I'm not an expert on Russia, so I don't want to give too many opinions. But I did have a dear friend in New Zealand. That's where I'm from, who came from Moldova to make a home in New Zealand, and basically she just said, "Fergus, don't go to Russia. It's an irrational society." That was her wisdom on the matter. Now, so you have Ukrainian heritage, U.S. born, U.S. veteran, Ukrainian
Yes.
heritage, and moved there. Why did you make that move about a decade ago?
I started visiting after getting out of the army. After my third combat tour, I started visiting. I liked it more and more. I was returning to the software business, and it was, as is usually the case when it's a big life decision, it was a confluence of many things. A great place to be an entrepreneur because you don't have to risk as much money because everything costs less there. Great base of tech talent, and it's sort of me reuniting with my heritage. My ancestors fled communism, and when I was leaving Ukraine this time with my two kids, I sort of joked with my mom, like, "Look, your dad left with two babies, and I'm leaving with two babies, although I'm doing it under much more comfortable circumstances." And in fact, after I dropped my family off at the Krakow airport, I returned to Ukraine to do volunteer work for about a month.
Okay. And did you not, 10 years ago, did you not foresee this coming then?
Um, you know, I've been saying it's inevitable for a long time. I just didn't think the scale would be so big. This mass invasion does not seem to me like the Russian way of war. Like the Russian way of war seems to me like a reverse blitzkrieg, like how they took Vladivostok from the Chinese, which was previously called Yongmingchen. They just spent decades massing troops near Yongmingchen, and only when China was involved in the Second Opium War, they kind of strong armed the city away from them and renamed it Vladivostok. Like that's the Russian way of war, massing and then using spies and propaganda that just demoralize and decay. But
But
yeah,
actually
so the
going into
scale,
direct combat.
right, instead of doing, because like they have a Potemkin village army too. They only pretend to have this modern maneuver army, but really they're undertrained, poorly equipped. Yeah, it's just mass. It's not like a modern combined arms army. And I wrote that in 2016.
Yeah, I've heard that the Russian economy is really only about the size of the Italian economy. And I think
Right.
if that is the case, how on earth can they afford to be this world, supposed superpower or military might?
That's a good question. Like they're really like I say things that could be taken disparagingly, but it's also something that you can be impressed by. Their economy is smaller, in fact, than Italy's, smaller than that of Texas. But they have a lot of nukes and they have incredible propaganda, and they've been incredible at it for a long time. And I guess that's enough.
Yeah, that's the that gets to the key reason why I got you on, Roman, because I have just seen how the confusion here in the United States is thick, right? People don't know what is going on over there, why. And I hear all sorts of arguments which really make me cringe or get me a bit sad that all these people who are, let's say, on the dissident right or who are paleo conservatives will say, well, Ukrainians are just Russians. And I think to myself, what does that justify? I mean, Canadians, a lot of them are Anglo-Saxons. Does that mean we can just invade Canada? It doesn't make any sense to me. So this is the crux. Why is it that progressives in the United States have made Ukraine their cause célèbre, and a lot of the conservatives are basically coming out in favor of the Russian invasion as though, and I don't want to get into all the details. Like I said, I'm not an expert on this, but it's extremely confusing.
Let me send you a picture here in the Zoom chat. So in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Donbass, they invaded Crimea too. They just um, the both all dissident groups, whether right or left, came out very strongly in favor of Russia. And what I sent you was a picture of an LGBT rally in New York City that was painting itself in pro-Russian colors and saying that they take no pride in supporting Ukrainian fascists. So Russia targets alternative media. They target dissenting opinion, and they're really good at creating a Potemkin village for anybody. So if you're like a very religious traditionalist guy, they'll sell you the Russian Orthodox Church without mentioning that it's run by a former KGB agent. If you're a radical Muslim, they'll sell you Chechnya. If you're a hardcore communist, they'll send you their communist roots. And in fact, there are like hardcore Italian communists who had took up arms in Donbass back in 2014. If you're sort of traditional conservative, I would suspect, as we are, I know that's what I am. I suspect you are as well.
Yeah.
Then they'll sell you just the disgust and the objections that we may have with Western institutions or some kind of Western movement, and they'll just build a Potemkin village for you, and you can support the Kremlin by believing what you believe in. And this is fairly explicitly stated by Alexander Dugin. He says you don't have to be pro-Russian. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as you oppose Atlanticism, or as long as you oppose the West. So they'll take any belief and they'll frame it for you so that you're opposing the West, and they will incorporate you. It's astonishing that they're able to do this. Like if you take a broad view and really study it, you can see what's happening. I guess if somebody is listening to this podcast and they themselves are kind of on the fence, not knowing what to believe, I think you can independently verify what I'm saying by listening to that famous Yuri Bezmenov interview, "Deception Was My Job." Yuri Bezmenov was a very high-level KGB agent who defected to the United States. He estimated that 85% of the KGB's resources were not spent on espionage, but spent on inserting talking points into the West. And he describes in great detail how that was done by identifying influencers. And just so you can imagine the granularity with which this was done, he was even sent to infiltrate a group of yoga practitioners because the KGB thought that maybe yoga kind of promoted this sort of navel-gazing detachment that was useful for subverting America. So at a very granular level, and I think I experienced this myself. I'll tell just a little anecdote. So I was a libertarian, largely in part because Ron Paul opposed the war in which I participated, the Iraq War. He was one of the few voices doing that consistently. And I had a little blog where I reposted a lot of Ron Paul style content. And then through the channels that I was getting this content, I discovered other issues. And when the war started with Georgia, Georgia also drifted west. They had in 2007, 2008, Georgia, the nation of Georgia was drifting west, and it also got invaded by Russia. So it's not just Ukraine. I reposted a lot of content about the Georgian war, and like I didn't realize this, I didn't put two and two together till later, but I did have a sponsor on the blog just for a brief period of time. They paid me like $30 a month to host this ridiculous link advertisement. And that period of time coincided, I realized later, when I was posting content about about the conflict in Georgia. I was posting Russian talking points about the conflict in Georgia, which I
Wow.
now know to be false. So like I had a blog with like less than 100 visitors a day, but I think somebody found me, and I couldn't prove it, but they just emailed me and said, "Hey, post this link and we'll pay you. We love your work." And that was it. So the evidence for like this being their policy is overwhelming, and I think the ridiculousness of many of the talking points also makes the case that it's deliberate.
The Gold newsletter is proudly sponsored by Inventa Capital Corporation, a venture capital advisory firm dedicated to the acquisition and development of assets in the natural resource sector. Today, Inventa is one of the premier mining groups with a first-rate portfolio of companies and a world-class team.
This is the Inventa Mining Update. I've got Chris Donaldson here. He is the Chief Executive of Outback Goldfields, and that is on the TSXV OZ or ounce and over-the-counter OZ BKF. He is overseeing projects in Australia, and he's actually going to be at an event in Arizona in a few days. So, Chris, welcome back to the show, and please tell us what you found out on your trip down under.
Hey, Fergus, thanks for having me again. Yeah, so I mean, it's almost unbelievable. We started this company 18 months ago, and of course with the COVID lockdowns, haven't been able to travel. So for the first time, I was able to go down with Chris Leslie, our geologist, and CFO Oda Halley, and meet the team on the ground in person. We certainly had a lot of Zoom calls with the group that we've got there, but never actually met them in person. And we're able to, of course, most excitingly tour the properties and get a real feel for the opportunity that we have there. So yeah, it was a great 10 days that we spent. And I've never been more convinced that we've got some really highly prospective properties here.
Great. And were you there when this latest press release from your firm came out, the one about the initial phase of exploration at the Unravels gold property?
Yeah, no. So that I literally got back two days ago, and that came out a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, I mean we really focused what we're doing now on two properties up at Unravels. We've done some initial drilling there, and we've undergone a RAB shallow drilling program really to try to find a couple of systems over the course of the property, and we centered it around a golden jacket mine, which is an old historic mine, which was very high grade, about 250 gram per ton. And it looks like there's definitely something there. We also extended a little bit to past that area. And found some other markings as well. So, one thing that we did conclude this week was to expand that program before we go in and start doing some diamond drilling. We think there may be other additional targets in and around the area that may be even bigger on that. So that's ongoing. And then happy to get down to Ballarat West, which we've always said we think is will rise and be our most prospective property. It's a large, 40,000+ hectare package that we have. But what's incredible about it is just the amount of gold that's been produced, in very near proximity to the property. Within 3 miles, there are multiple million-ounce deposits. There's been 17 million ounces produced just on the outskirts of the property. And then amazingly, our property hasn't had a lot of drilling or exploration, and the reason for that, of course, is that it's covered with a basalt layer. Luckily, it's not that thick on our property. It's kind of about 5 to 10 meters throughout. So when you look at one of the maps, and we have one on our presentation, you see all these historic workings coming right up and then stopping, right at the edge of the property. And the reason for that is there was outcrop, and it was alluvial workings at surface, and easy to mine, but then it dips undercover. So we really believe they extend through the property, and we have a very good chance of hopefully getting a million ounce discovery ourselves.
Yeah, folks. So this is in Central Victoria, Australia, and you've described the Ungroon as highly prospective. Do you want to clarify for people who don't necessarily know how you use that term?
Yeah, I mean, so what's happening in Victoria, and it's the kind of crown jewel in the area is the Fosterville mine, which many consider the highest grade and highest margin mine in the world. And they made an incredible discovery about 5 years ago when they went deeper and found a swan zone, and at one point were mining up to about 50 grams per ton. So the area, because of that discovery, it started what they're calling a second gold rush. The first was in about 1850, and so people are going back into these old areas where there was historic mining that had occurred. And going below this cover and trying to find the fluid source for these systems. So when we say highly prospective, generally means that there's been a lot of gold or high grade gold that has been mined in the area, but it was the alluvial gold at or near surface. So we're going after trying to find the fluid source, going below cover, and really trying to tie into the system through the quartz veins.
Yeah, many of us, obviously, we're gold bugs. We anticipate a breakout, especially among the juniors, since the senior miners have already seen great gains. What can you tell people about the timeline for whether that can happen with Outback?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been a tough market. I mean, we're starting to see a little bit of movement with the seniors. But the juniors haven't quite got the love that we had been expecting. Especially with gold prices, over 1,900 right now. You'd think it would start coming down. I can't control that. I think we're going in the right direction generally, and eventually it will come down the food chain, so to speak. But what I can do is control what we're doing on the ground and hopefully find some discoveries. And at some point, these gold, these producers and mid tiers have to start filling their pipeline as well. And hopefully, at that point, we can be a beneficiary of that.
Yeah, what I mean though, in terms of your own timeline, you've done the initial phase of, let's say, drilling, but when will we see more results to really perk interest?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everybody wants results, right? So we are drilling. It's shallow drilling. It's and much of what we're doing right now is for target identification. There's a real balance, in what we do in terms of doing things methodically and preserving cash and doing kind of a less expensive drilling initially, which will give us a higher probability of tying into something when we start doing the diamond drilling. So, like I said, we've expanded the program up at Ungroon. We've just launched a large program at Ballarat West. All of that is to better understand, what we have, and hopefully tie into some high arsenic anomalies, which is associated with the gold, so that when we do go back and do the diamond drilling, we have a higher probability there. So, the next, I'm going to say 3-4 months will be focused on that type of efforts. And then, once the end of summer and early fall, we'll get in with the diamond drilling. Not to say we might not hit something on the shallow drilling. It'll just be higher probability once we get to the diamond.
I got you, folks. The website is outbackgoldfields.com. And as I said, TSXV, OZ on the over-the-counter OZ BKF. And we'll be speaking with Chris Donaldson. Thanks for your time.
All right. Thanks, Fergus.
even someone who's appeared on this show, it turned out, is being funded. His YouTube channel is being funded by RT, the RT network, which I was shocked because, as you've said, maybe in their last appearance, they seem to support a lot of these dissident, even libertarian voices who would undermine, let's say, the legitimacy of the regime they live under. The fact that you mentioned Georgia is important because it helps people understand what's going on in Ukraine, actually. If for those who don't know, Georgia is still an occupied country. Still, two portions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, are still occupied and, I guess, quasi or de facto part of Russia at this time. So what is the trajectory then? So is this, the Russian government, I don't know whether we want to say Vladimir Putin, and whether he's driving all this, but will they be satisfied with just a portion of Ukraine, or will they retreat? What's going to happen at this time?
It's definitely not Vladimir Putin. I could easily imagine Russians electing someone far worse than him. It is the mentality, and it has been their mentality for 500 years. And you don't have to ask a Ukrainian, you could ask any of their neighbors from Finland to Georgia. I think Russia is in sort of a deal with the devil. They have to expand or collapse. They cannot live inside their borders and just be peaceful. Russia, previously Muscovy, it was Tsar Peter that renamed Muscovy Russia. Muscovy rose as a vassal state of the Golden Horde, which was the successor of the Mongols, and they continued all of their absolutist totalitarian traditions, governing by fear and intimidation and extreme cruelty. And you can say perhaps that was even perhaps that was inevitable of a civilization rising on the edge of the Eurasian steppe. That was the way of the steppe. But they've continued those traditions, and the most important thing, like if you want to understand Russian nihilism, if you want to understand like what Russia will do, just think of someone who's absolutely desperate to appear strong no matter what. So there are credible reports of Russia using mobile crematoriums to hide their casualties. Like that's unthinkable, I think, for most Westerners, but for them it makes most perfect sense because they cannot appear weak. So I think, yeah, it's a different civilization built on this idea that they have to appear strong at all costs. So I think a lot of Russians are staring at the void right now, that they've been militarily, I wouldn't say defeated, but had enormous setbacks in Ukraine. And like the most important thing to them, the appearance of strength is gone.
So I don't understand. Okay, so they want to maintain this veneer of authority, but if on the ground they just continue to lose men, how long can this go on?
Right, not forever, that's for sure. So
Because
yeah,
I do
expand
listen
or
to a lot of
collapse.
I do listen to a lot of foreign policy podcasts, and just a few weeks before the invasion, there was an expert who said that basically this was not a Ukraine that could be easily conquered. That they had been they'd been preparing basically, and so the question then is, didn't the memo get to the Russians, and how long are they willing to expend their resources?
Those are really good questions. Did the memo get to them? Certainly not. Authoritarian regimes very often believe their own propaganda. And in fact, this has been commented on by leaks, unverified leaks from the FSB, that they're completely taken aback, both by the resistance, the lack of support, by everything. So then they fall back to plan B, or maybe to plan C or D at this stage, where they just resort to being very brutal and showing that they're strong. How long can they keep it up? Not Not too freaking long. They could go nuclear to reassert their appearance of strength. I hope that the consequences of doing that outweigh outweigh what they might see as the benefits. I think the chances are small but very real. I think it's definitely being considered. But yeah, they can't keep it up for long. Maybe they're going to try to just hold what they've taken and plan to keep invading in 10, 20 years from now, resume.
Is that the likely outcome, that just a further portion of Ukraine will be chipped away and nominally Russian?
I think it is, and that's a tragedy because that's a big disturbance to the post World War II order, where the rules more or less were everyone stay inside their borders because wars are too expensive and destructive. Um, but Russia is in a deal with the devil. If they don't expand and they don't demonstrate to their own populace that they're strong, the populace will revolt and throw off the leader and find somebody who is willing to expand. Um, they will collapse if they don't expand, and that can't go on forever either, because Russia used to threaten the whole world, and then they threatened Europe, but now they're only threatening the eastern reaches of Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine. So thankfully, these totalitarian systems do not create prosperity. If they did, we'd be in trouble. So now they'll be doing this with Ukraine, but I hope if their idea is to wait for 10, 20 years and then continue attacking, maybe they'll only be dealing with things even further to the east because their economy will have shrunken so.
Right. Yeah. One hopes that the neighboring states will grow so well economically that it'll become harder and harder to dominate them. There's one other topic which Brian London, the editor of Gold Newsletter, mentioned in this month's newsletter, and I'm just going to refer to it briefly, but the headline he has is "Russia ties the ruble to gold." But what does it mean? So, of course, we have an economically oriented audience, and many people have heard about the ruble suddenly being backed by gold. And when I heard this, I thought this is a scam. But have you been following this development?
Not at all. This is a complete surprise to me. I will tell you that a YouTuber named Perun, who's also he's from Australia. You folks down under are doing the Lord's work. He has done a great, extensive assessment of Russia's economy. So I would weigh this this backing of the ruble by gold with his assessment, and I'll send you a link.
Yeah, folks, if you're not already a subscriber to Gold Newsletter, do go to goldnewsletter.com. This month, Brian gives his assessment, and I don't want to give it away. I don't want to do any spoilers here, but Brian assesses it decisively. Now, what will happen in terms of, let's say, the economic fallout, though? Because in many ways, the economic fallout, I mean, I don't want to perhaps overstate this, but it causes substantial damage comparable to a real war, right? To the actual war itself. And when I say for how long will Russia be involved in Ukraine, I guess the follow-up question is, how long will all these sanctions be in place and hurting both the Russians and her trading partners, or their trading partners? Is this going to be almost permanent?
Well, as a Ukrainian American with deep sympathies to Ukraine, I certainly hope the world is willing to pay the cost. And in fact, that's what if this is a long-term conflict, as I think it will be, that will be the determining factor. It's not up to Ukrainians, unfortunately. It's probably up to Western willingness to support it. I don't know. I don't know what Western willingness is to keep these sanctions in place long term. I'll say even short of that, there are significant blows to Russia's economy, like the nationalization of all these business assets. Like that's kind of a one-shot pistol. You can't do that twice. And after you've nationalized $10 billion worth of airplanes, it's not going to be easy to get reinvestment in your industries.
Yeah. How much of an impact do the sanctions impose, right? So I know that there were sanctions on Cuba, or have been, for more than half a century, and it just seems like the regime that they're willing to take it. They're willing to let their constituents hurt. Is that the case with the Russians as well? That they're just willing to suffer the sanctions?
The Russian regime has always had a big disregard for human life. That's a consequence of, the civilization that rose to power on the edge of the Eurasian steppe. That's been observed by American generals in World War II, their disregard for human life. So the Kremlin is certainly willing to have their people suffer sanctions. I think they're more afraid of appearing weak. They're more afraid of Russians asking questions like, why are we living in crap while people across the border in Finland and Estonia or wherever else are living quite well? That's what's scary
Exactly.
to
It
them.
becomes more and more visible.
Yep.
How much democratic accountability exists in Russia? Right. This is where, again, many of us are confused. To what degree is there any democracy there?
There's none. There's like a Potemkin village of democracy where I think for 2 years Putin put his associate Medvedev as president, who was
Yes.
constantly praising Putin, and then they switched back to Putin himself. So if they need to appear like a democracy, they will appear like a democracy. If they need to appear as anything, they will appear as anything, but they will remain an autocracy.
Yeah. And before we got going, I did mention Russia Insider, this publication that many people here in the United States or elsewhere have latched onto, given the pro-Russia side of events. And I wonder, these are actually American expats living in Russia, running this site. Who funds this operation? I don't really get it. I'm very confused as to how I guess nominally independent outlet is so influential and gives this Russian side. So it ties into my earlier question. Yes, okay, the Russians spend a lot of money and time on this propaganda, but it just seems like even how can I put it, occupy or acquire the American expats who I just don't get. I don't get it how they would go there and then start singing Putin's praises.
Well, it's especially shocking for me. A year ago, my wife and I speculated about buying a home before we decided to move to the U.S. Speculated about buying a home in Bucha. We've driven through there 100 times. It was a thriving suburb, affluence. Every time we drove through, we'd spot some new restaurants or a yoga studio or whatever. So, like this, it's especially shocking to me because for me, this is a very personal. But I can acknowledge that there is some truth in the expression that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I
Right.
think if people feel threatened enough by their own Western governments, they will latch on to people who oppose that government. Though I think it's an absolute outrage. I think that this is morally, it's very clear what's happening, which side to be on.
Yeah, and I know you have been a non-interventionist, but in this case, basically, I guess maybe as you've matured, you see that maybe there's a more of a role for foreign policy in such instances from the Americans.
Well, I don't think I've ever been a interventionist. I opposed the Iraq War and still feel angry about it. At how anti-war voices were silenced at the time. There were some journalists who lost their jobs because they opposed the Iraq War. But no, I've never been non-interventionist as a general position. And you know what? Like my work has been conveying the Ukrainian perspective and just pointing out the most obvious lies and pointing out the mechanisms of Russian propaganda. I have not commented on what Western policy should be, and I think I'll continue to refrain from
You
that.
try to avoid it. Okay. What other myths are circulating then that you want to address before we finish up?
Well, I think we covered the big ones. This is not about NATO. Russia has never not been threatening Ukraine. And in their domestic propaganda, like they say Ukraine should not exist. We need to erase Ukrainian identity. So their propaganda on Russian television is already completely genocidal, which is scary. Long history of this, of Russia, of Muscovy, just being extremely cruel. Tolstoy, who's a Russian patriot, commented on this when he wrote about the Cossacks. He just talked about their needless cruelty. Novgorod was a thriving city-state near Moscow, and they were drifting west. Even though they were located further east, they had a lot of ties to Poland and to Lithuania. And so Muscovy went there 3 times and massacred everybody under Ivan the Terrible. The third time they killed everybody who wasn't a peasant. And that's how Novgorod became a part of Muscovy. Georgia, when Georgia was drifting west in 2007, 2008, Russia invaded and took 20% of their land. So this is not about Ukraine joining NATO. It's about who the Russians are and their deal with the devil.
What about all these biolabs? I don't really understand that aspect. Yeah,
I don't think it's true. I don't know. I don't think it's true at all. Like, why the hell? Like, I've been through a lot of these places. These are really poor areas. Like, I could not imagine having a biolab there. And I guess I don't want to spend all my time dispelling these Russian stories, although I'd be happy to if there's a specific one that someone's concerned about. Because if you do all of that, you do not write, then you're not paying attention to the hundreds of testimonies of mass killing and execution and rape that happened in Bucha. So like it fulfills its role as a distraction if all you do is spend your time dispelling it. Though if there are people who sincerely believe it, we could spend time there. I guess one quick way to dispel it is to point out where the propaganda stands in the chain. And I can't comment specifically to the biolabs because I haven't paid attention to it. But how about the bombing of the theater in Mariupol? Russia's first propaganda was it was not a refugee center, it was the Azov headquarters. And Russian diplomats said that it was not a refugee center, it was the Azov headquarters, and we did great by bombing it. And only when the evidence of all the mass casualties became overwhelming did they say, okay, we didn't bomb it, the Ukrainians bombed it. And it's like that so many times where like they just evolve the propaganda until something sticks. So I think pointing that out is sort of good sort of protection against people actually believing the one talking point that sticks.
Okay, now I do recommend people follow you because well, at least until recently, you've been engaging a lot with this topic. So Twitter is one place, your website as well.
RomanInUkraine.com, and you can find the Twitter from there. Yeah.
Right. Just RomanInUkraine.com. We'll have all the links at goldenuser.com/podcast. I see a lot of you. I retweet and see a lot of your content as well. So I encourage people to, follow Roman and just try to think independently, because I fear we are in the midst of this propaganda war. And as you say, even I get caught up in this and distracted. It's very hard to know what is going on. So thanks for your time, Roman. Best of luck for your life back in the United States now. I'm glad to have you, and I hope we get to catch up one of these days.
Thank you.